mother had come from a community in Sweden. She was unused to America anyway. She had no intention of staying. She'd come on the promise that as soon as they had proved up on the homestead, they would return to Sweden. Because many people did that speculatively. They would take this free land offered by the government and then sell it after 3 years. At first it was 5 years, but then 3 years. And she hated the wind. It's very oppressive in central Montana. She lived in a 2-room shack where she had lived in a beautiful home, and mostly she missed trees. And you can imagine that on the Montana prairies, how you miss trees. And there were the everyday problems. You had to begin fencing, for one thing, almost immediately if my father was away, and a trip to town was a 2-day trip, and she was alone. The range horses and the range cattle will come right up to the window and put their right and look in the window, and she was scared to death. So the first thing was to fence the yard, and then gradually you had to fence the fields. And you had to build everything, and you had to break the sod, and the sod was very tough. Dad said that he used to go out when he had a little spare time after it had been turned over the first time by the plow and just hack at it with a hatchet to break it up. But by the time the homestead rush from after 1900, all the places by a live stream had been taken. So it was the open benchlands, and it was the grass which cured itself and turned brown within a few weeks. Now that was a fine thing for range cattle. It had been a fine thing for the buffalo, but it didn't look like grass to people who came from the east or came from Europe. It was the very barrenness. It was very, and the wind could just sweep across it unstopped, unrestrained.
Farming in Montana has never been easy. With inadequate rainfall and recurring drought, it's been hard to get the land to yield. Even the broad valleys of the west are semi-arid. They get about 18 inches of precipitation in a good year. These were the first valleys cultivated in Montana. In the 1840s, Catholic missionaries began small vegetable gardens in the Bitterroot Valley. Soon, they had successfully cultivated large fields of wheat and potatoes. By the 1860s, isolated farms extended north to Missoula. Then, during the gold rush, farmers found that the mountain valleys near the gold fields were fertile. Although the growing season was short, the land was good and water was available. And with a hungry market in the mining camps, the land looked even better. Small farms quickly sprouted in the valleys along the Continental Divide. The most productive farms lay in the broad Gallatin Valley. By 1867, the valley boasted 3 flour mills. But when the gold ran out, farmers had a tough time. They stayed on, however. Slowly, farms appeared to the north and east of the broad mountain valleys. Indian reservations and later open range grazing kept them out of eastern Montana. That and the lack of water. Even though Congress passed the first Homestead Act in 1862, few homesteaders came to Montana before 1900. With fertile land and plenty of moisture in the Midwest, there was no need to travel past the 98th meridian. That was the rainfall line separating the subhumid Midwest from the semi-arid Great Plains. Many studied the problem of aridity in order to develop an agriculture suited to the plains. One of the first was John Wesley Powell, director of the United States Geologic Survey. In his report to Congress in 1878, Powell criticized the 160-acre homestead allotment. In his opinion, it wasn't enough for dry states like Montana. A quarter section of land alone will be of no value, he explained. The pasturage it will afford will not suffice to maintain a herd that even the poorest man will need for his support. Over 30 years later, Congress passed an enlarged Homestead Act. This increased the allotment to 320 acres. Even this would not have satisfied Powell. He recommended 2,560 acres, or about 4 sections, as the minimum size for a family farm on the Great Plains. Homesteaders would learn the hard way that John Wesley Powell knew what he was talking about. But at the turn of the century, many thought the problem of aridity could be mitigated with something called dry land farming. It was designed to help farmers grow crops in dry areas without using irrigation. Paris Gibson became the leading spokesman for dry farming in Montana. At a conference in 1900, the founder of Great Falls proclaimed, "There never was a greater error than the belief that a large rainfall is necessary to successful grain growing on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. Under proper cultivation of these soils, you can produce excellent crops of wheat, even in seasons so dry that the native grasses will not grow on the uncultivated prairie." The days of the pioneer were supposed to be over. But with the words of Paris Gibson echoing in their hearts, many immigrants looked to Montana. With dry farming and a bigger homestead, with a few good years of rain, and a few years of high prices, it seemed just possible.
Generally, we think of homesteading as being part of the frontier experience, and in many ways it was. And if that's true, then Montana was probably the most accessible frontier that the country had ever had. Before the homesteading era, railroads are already into the state. That means the problems of transportation are virtually nil. That's transportation of people in and products out. So it becomes a very attractive place for homesteading. At the same time, Montana is experiencing a period of some of the most wet years that it would ever have, before or since. And so in some ways, the physical environment is more attractive to those who don't know about droughts and dry land than it may have been otherwise. Also, the time period is important. There is only one period in all of American history when farming generally was prosperous. That is, people in farming could expect the same return on their investment and labor as if you had made that investment in some alternative enterprise. And that is exactly coincident with the time period of Montana homesteading. So all the elements, farming is a prosperous enterprise, whether you're in Iowa or Illinois or in California or potentially now in Montana. Certainly that was generally understood at the time. And so Montana, as being the last area seeming to have endless amounts of free land, or nearly free land, is very attractive. It's easy to get here. Jim Hill and the Northern Pacific Railroad will probably bring you here for nothing. If you have to pay your own way, you can get there at least by train. You could come into the southern part of the state through the Union Pacific. And so transportation is not what it once was. It's not a big problem. So it's an easy place to get to relatively.
Although no single factor created the land boom in Montana, promotion certainly played a large part. Railroad companies were among the biggest promoters. They held seminars on dry farming. They transported agricultural exhibits to faraway places, like Omaha, and they offered special rates to immigrants. The Milwaukee Road was the first. It promoted the Judith Basin throughout the Midwest and the South, and it opened a field office in Fergus County to assist with immigration. Many blame the railroads for making false promises to the hopeful newcomers. The fact is, local business and community interests throughout the region promoted homesteading just as vigorously. Real estate investors, bankers, merchants, trade associations, and public officials all conspired to sell Montana to potential homesteaders. State publications insisted that turning the sod increased precipitation. Their slogan was, "Rainfall follows the plow." Brochures gave figures for average rainfall, but omitted years with low levels, or listed figures for wet counties. If it was a fraud, and it was at times, it was a fraud the homesteaders wanted to believe in.
They came because here was a chance to get rich, and all the propaganda, railroad propaganda and advertisements, and even people telling each other. And we had it happened that the early years of the homestead rush were very prosperous here. There was more than average. 1910 was a dry year. 1909 had been a wonderful year. But from 1911 till 1916, the rainfall was almost the highest we've ever had in this state on the average. And the crops were wonderful, and the price was rising every year because of the war in Europe, so that people came here expecting to get rich.
They really are a remarkable cross-section of the country. You could probably find almost every profession represented, although they're the minority. Most of these people are relatively young. That is, they're in their 20s or at most in their early 30s. They haven't quite ever made it back home, and this seems to be the time of opportunity. A surprising number of women homesteaders. Generally speaking, they tend to be teachers who came here in part to accept employment in the growing communities that are associated with the homesteading and taking up homesteads themselves. There are doctors, there are lawyers, there is at least 2 professional prize fighters, 1 professional wrestler, and the one who always gets the most attention, a professional deep-sea diver. That did not represent the norm. An awful lot of these people, given the nature of our country in these years, had some experience farming, but few of them were actual farmers themselves. Probably they grew up on farms or grew up in small towns very closely associated with farms, and consequently had the thought that they could successfully farm if they just had some land. Montana was the place where there was land.
The homesteaders faced an arduous task, a formidable land. Some overcame the land, some the land defeated. Many men left their wives and families on the homestead. Some left to earn a living elsewhere. Some left and never came back. The women stayed on.
When the railroads wanted to recruit homesteaders into Montana, they used posters. One of the most famous posters has the picture of a woman on it. She stands in the middle of a vast field. She's wearing this lovely white dress, and under her arm she holds a thick sheaf of wheat. She's looking into the distance, maybe even into the future. She's part of the sunbonnet myth. The sunbonnet myth concerns homesteading women, all those women who were stalwart, who overcame the myriad hardships of farming on the Great Plains. In some ways, this myth overdraws the hardships and the courage, the woman making meals, the woman keeping the house, overcoming rattlesnakes, storms, and isolation. But it is a myth that we Americans are very fond of. In some ways, it's not quite right.
Well, of course, they did suffer from isolation and loneliness, too. But I think that sometimes depended on the geographic location and the density of settlement. I think another thing we have to remember about women on the homestead frontier is that they performed, in many instances, essential economic tasks aside from the domestic ones. Many families did not have enough income and had to supplement their farm income with the head of the family working for wages off the farm part of the year. And when that happened, the women performed farm chores and directed the work of the farm and kept the place going.
The federal government encouraged the rapid development of America's interior, regardless of the cost and frustration, disappointment, and sheer physical exhaustion. It passed the homestead laws, offered land grants to railroad companies, and it took land from Indian reservations and opened it up to homesteaders. The Dawes Act of 1887 was supposed to be a model in Indian reform legislation. Concerned whites in the East sincerely believed that assimilation into the mainstream culture would save the vanishing race, and they believed land ownership would make responsible citizens out of the Indians. However, for the Dawes Act to succeed, Native Americans had to give up traditional ways. Almost overnight, Indians were supposed to reject their mobile hunting culture and become sedentary landowners. In addition, The Dawes Act freed up so-called surplus Indian land and made it available to homesteaders and railroad companies.
The Indian then began to feel that essentially he was being moved from one area to another. One of the great Sioux chiefs finally said, "Why don't you just put us on wheels?" And that might have been a good thing, because there they were being moved from one area of the country to in an ever-shrinking land base. And finally, when the reservations were essentially broken up, which is what the Dawes Act did, the Indian was confined to very small individual allotments of either 40, 80, or 160 acres. Those in that time I have read have referred to and looked upon those land allotments and reservations as nothing more than concentration camps, because they could no longer roam and move as freely as they did as independent nations, as sovereign nations, into which they had entered into treaties with the new United States government. It mandated an even more, a very sad and a tragic loss of their culture in terms of, again, fostering a dependency system, having to depend upon the white man's wares, the white man's food. It meant that he had to change his diet, he had to change his way of living, he had to move into houses, he had to change his way of dress. He had to begin essentially thinking like the white man, talking like the white man. And that was essentially what education did, because once they were confined to their allotments and already being subjected to Christianity in the process of, quote, civilizing them, then the next and most natural step was then to begin educating them, and through education begin to assimilate them. So it was a means of changing them from Indians into the image of a white yeoman farmer who was to till his land and live on his individual allotment, which was certainly a drastic change in terms of how they had lived culturally on this land, to having to live essentially like white people.
Assimilation really couldn't work. For one thing, Indians resisted it. For another, the white community remained hostile to Indians. The wars with them were still too close. Historian Vern Dusenberry described the period from 1885 to 1917 as one of impatience and vituperation in Montana. People did not want to see Indians at their doorsteps, he wrote, especially Indians who were nomads without a treaty or without a home. Yet for over 30 years, 2 bands of Indians did roam throughout the state. These Indians were Rocky Boy's group of Chippewa, who had migrated from Wisconsin through Canada, and Little Bear's band of Cree, who fled Canada to escape punishment over the particularly brutal massacre of a white settlement. These 2 small bands lived on other reservations for a time, or near Montana's big cities, eating refuse from dumps and slaughterhouses. The Indians' plight aroused many whites throughout Montana. Charlie Russell wrote one winter, "It doesn't look good for the people of Montana if they will sit and see a lot of women and children starve to death in this kind of weather." But most communities resisted the placing of a permanent reservation for either group nearby.
Well, the establishment of the Rocky Boy Reservation is really the end of a very long and fairly complex process. There are several different people involved, that is, the people who would live there. At least since the 1890s, 2 Indian groups were identified in Montana that had not been associated with the state or the territory at an earlier time. These were Chippewa and Cree. There's a 3rd group that probably more appropriately should be considered separately, but is difficult to separate out from the other 2, and these are people referred to as Métis. That's a French term essentially meaning mixed. In the literature of the time, even by those most sympathetic, you see this confusion over and over again. Consequently, it's probably not correct to say the Métis were excluded from the Rocky Boy Reservation, because a great many Métis, in fact, did live on Rocky Boy. At the same time, a great many Cree and a great many Chippewa were excluded as well. They're not on the reservation. It's partly that they simply weren't there at the proper time. At the time that the reservation was created, Rocky Boy and his group, Little Bear and his group, had actually been on the ground for about a year. Those who chose to travel to Butte, to travel to Great Falls, to be in Helena, simply seeking food and work, probably were not included. The principal opposition came from the people of Havre, who also wanted access to the Assiniboine Reserve. Ultimately, sometime in 1915, William Bull seems to have worked out an arrangement with the leading citizens of Havre that would split the parts of the Assiniboine Reserve, providing a park along Beaver Creek for the people of Havre, and also providing a relatively small reservation for Rocky Boy and the Cree.
Landed or landless, it really didn't matter. It was a terrible time for all Indians during the first years of confinement. Illness of all kinds was a problem. Alcoholism, TB, smallpox, trachoma. They were made worse by the scarcity of medical care on the reservations. But a few Indians survived. From 1900 to 1914, the Northern Cheyenne developed a successful livestock industry. Their success persuaded Congress to create a loan fund in 1910. Indians could borrow money from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to buy farm implements, tools, and animals. Although the 1910 law attempted to promote agriculture, the Northern Cheyenne used their loan to stock the range. Meanwhile, about 40 other Northern Cheyenne successfully worked irrigated farms. With new optimism, they broke more sod in 1911 than they had in preceding years. But between 1911 and 1914, several changes disrupted life on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. The changes affected the cattle industry profoundly. By 1914, the herd had dwindled from 9,000 head to 3,500. The industry died abruptly. In some ways, life was as hard for the homesteader as for the Indian in those days. Many were foreign-born. Many brought their families. Torn from their cultural roots, they too were forced to assimilate in an alien environment. They too tried to survive on unpromising land. They fought disease, poverty. Anna Zellick writes that her grandmother, a homesteader, shed tears from physical pain and keen disappointment with her new home in America. Towns sprang up in the homestead areas because farmers in the surrounding country needed markets to sell their produce and markets for buying necessities. The new towns didn't resemble the villages back home in Europe. They looked and smelled different. The people were different too. These were American towns.
Callisto Brizzoli saw a Milwaukee Railroad poster when he worked in the quarries in Illinois. He decided he would go to Montana and become a farmer. He ended up in Culbertson, Montana. He could have come to Havre, or he could have come someplace like here in Moore. The homesteading towns were small. They existed on two sides of a central street. They were primarily family-oriented. People came together with brothers and sisters, with children and husbands and wives. In the mining towns, they came mostly as single men, sometimes two brothers together. The most central fact about the homestead towns was their economic viability. Most of them, like Moore, tended to slip into obscurity as time went on. The hotels, the banks, such as this one, failed.
Small towns in Montana had a sense of cohesion because they were family-oriented. They also supplied goods and services for about a 10-mile radius for the settlers. And they were also the centers of the church, school, and social life of the community.
A 100 main streets, 1,000 crisscross the nation. Like the homesteaders who look back, we view the times, the towns, and they look good. Main Street, the city park, perhaps a beer Saturday night, church on Sunday, big houses and close families. Main Street, closed, narrow, bigoted. Main Street hid a number of evils behind a facade of order and civilization. The saloon, the sweatshop, the pool hall. Things were happening on Main Street. Times were changing. People were changing. They changed the land after all, changed themselves. Now they wanted to change the world.